Six Blind Elephants, page 128. Exercise like/important. Trios, 20 minutes. There is a guide who asks questions and notices the answers. An explorer who answers the questions and notices any changes in their internal experience. And an observer who primarily observes the explorer's nonverbal responses, voice, tone, facial expressions, gestures, etc. Take about 5 minutes per round, and then rotate positions so that you experience what it is like to be in each position. After all three have experienced each position, use another 5 minutes to discuss what you observed and share experiences. Although you can do this simple exercise alone, you will learn much more if you find 2 other people to do it with you. If no one else is readily available, you can do the exercise by yourself. But you will lose the opportunity for feedback and observation from others. First, choose a pleasant experience. Guide asks explorer, what is an experience that you enjoy? Explorer chooses something, X, and briefly identifies the experience verbally. A good meal, while internally noticing both the content and the qualities of the internal image, sound, feeling. Liking. The guide asks explorer, what do you like about X? The explorer replies verbally, while noticing any changes in his/her internal images. While the guide writes down the explorer's response, and the observer notices the explorer's accompanying nonverbal responses. Repeat this step 3 times. What else do you like about X? 3. Importance. The guide asks explorer, what is important to you about X? The explorer replies verbally while noticing any changes in their internal representation, while the guide writes down the explorer's verbal response, and the observer notices the explorer's accompanying nonverbal responses. Repeat this step 3 more times. What else is important to you about X? Rotate positions so that each person has an experience in each role before going on to step 4. 4. Discussion. Which question tended to elicit a change in scope, and which a change in category? How did the explorer's internal images change in response to these questions about liking and importance? How did the explorer's nonverbal response differ to the questions? It can also be very useful, though not as pleasant, to try this exercise with an experience that you don't enjoy, in order to understand it better and explore additional choices. When we ask questions, the words we use will influence whether the other person responds with a scope or category shift in their internal experience. When we ask questions, the words we use will influence whether the other person responds with a scope or category shift in their internal experience. When we ask what do you like about the outcome, we usually get more sensory-based information about the outcome, an expansion of scope detail. If their response to the question continues with a secondary-based outcome, that will be useful in discovering more about the experience, but won't be helpful in understanding how they categorize it. However, if we ask, what is important to you about that outcome, we are much more likely to get a response that indicates a more general category of experience, which will withdraw attention from the details of the experience itself. This will be very useful when we want to understand how someone categorizes, but won't be helpful if we want to discover more about their experience of the outcome itself. Chunking. Chunking up and chunking down are very useful processes that have been used in the field of NLP for making changes in someone's experience. However, sometimes they have been used to describe a change in scope and sometimes a change in category, without distinguishing between them. Chunking up has always been presented as the reverse of chunking down, the only difference being the direction of the change in chunking. However, Robert Dilts, one of the more widely respected authors in the field, defines chunking down as a change in scope, but chunking up as a change in categorization. Chunking down. A car may be chunked down into tires, engine, brake system, transmission, etc., breaking the elements of the belief into smaller pieces. Chunking up, grouping cars, trains, boats, and airplanes as forms of transportation, generalizing an element of a belief to a larger classification. These definitions present chunking up and chunking down as completely different processes rather than inverse processes. Since the word chunking is so ambiguous, it will serve to not use the term, but instead be more specific about whether we are making a shift in scope or category. In the development of any field, successively finer discriminations are made in order to deepen understanding and make our methods more specific, appropriate, and effective. The fundamental difference between scope and category is a refinement that it is long overdue. The fundamental difference between scope and category is a refinement that is long overdue. Scope and category in psychotherapy. Most therapists are pretty vague about exactly what questions to ask or what statements to make in order to help people change. General methods like paraphrasing, reflecting feelings, or emphasizing are taught without specifying how they can be used systematically to change scope or category. Accordingly, we would have to study extensive transcripts of sessions in order to find out how most therapists change scope and category. Together, there is a very systematic approach developed by James Lowley and Penny Tompkins called symbolic modeling, using clean language, based on the work of David Grove. In addition, the book describing this approach is exceptionally clear and specific, and the authors have also produced an unedited videotaped demonstration, something that very few therapists are willing to do. A videotape makes it possible to review exactly what the practitioners of an approach actually do in a session, which is often very different from their description of what they think they are doing. A videotape also provides a wealth of nonverbal information, which is a very important aspect of communication, often even more important than the verbal. In very condescending outline, in symbolic modeling, the therapist begins with a shared personal history and asks them to define an overall outcome. In very condensed outline, in symbolic modeling, the therapist begins with a shared personal history and asks them to define an overall outcome. After this, the self-modeling process starts with the basic opening question: and what would you like to have happen? The therapist listens carefully to the words in the client's response, and also for the symbolic or metaphoric aspects of the client's communication. The therapist then asks a question that includes some or all of the exact words just used by the client. These questions are also sometimes asked in response to nonverbal postures or gestures, including them in the client's scope of experience. These questions are also sometimes asked in response to nonverbal postures or gestures, including them in the client's scope of experience. The question is usually taken from a list of 9 basic developing questions, and less often from another list of 21 additional specialists' questions, which are asked less than 20% of the time. In the list of 9 basic development questions below, 3 dots indicate whether the therapist repeats the client's words, which can be a single word, a phrase, or everything the client just said, depending on where you want to direct their attention. Read these questions and decide whether each one elicits a change in scope or category. First, and is there anything else about client's words? Second, and what kind of ... is that ... represents the client's words. Third, and that's ... like what? Fourth, and where is ... 5, and whereabouts ... Sixth, and when what and then what happens? Seventh, and what happens next? Eighth, and what happens just before ... 9, and where could ... come from? Question 2. asks the client for an explicit categorization of their experience at a more specific logical level, a subcategory of the existing one. Question 3 asks the client to make a comparison and invites a metaphoric response, which requires an implicit categorization at a more general logical level. All the other questions ask for scope. Question 1 asks for more detail, while 4 and 5 ask about scope and space. Questions 6 and 7 extend the scope of the time into the future, and 8 and 9 extend the scope of the time into the past. There is a good deal of redundancy in the questions. 4 and 5 are nearly identical, as are 6th and 7th. Of the 21 additional specialists' questions, which are asked less than 20% of the time, 2 ask for a comparison, which implicitly asks for category. One of these asks same or different, and the other asks about a relationship between two elements of experience. Again, all the other specialist questions ask the client to clarify some aspects of scope. Nearly half ask about some aspects of space, where, distance, direction, far, etc. And 6 have to do with motivation or intention, like, drawn. This emphasis on developing awareness of scope is parallel with many meditative and spiritual approaches that say that deep and full awareness of a problem is all that is needed in order to bring about movement and change. The repeated use of and as connects each question and the response to the question to the client's preceding experience. The repetition of the client's preceding words also connects each response and question in the same way, so that each new scope or category is added to what is already in the client's experience, rather than replacing it. This expands and enriches the client's experience of the problem or outcome. To summarize, this psychotherapeutic method is based on asking the client to change the scope of their experience in a variety of ways, occasionally asking them to categorize it metaphorically. Expanding scope always results in more information that can be useful in solving problems. Asking the client to recategorize their experience is also useful, because that associates it with the other examples in the new category. This process continues until the client comes to some kind of resolution. The therapist never makes a statement and only responds from the list of questions. The therapist never makes a statement and only responds from the list of questions. This is called clean language, because the therapist does not introduce new content, but simply asks open-ended questions about what the client has already said. Asking the client to change scope is a content-free intervention, and asking them to recategorize their experience is also content-free, since the recategorization emerges from the client's experience. However, this protection from content introduced by someone else is double-edged sword. However, this protection from content introduced by someone else is double-edged sword, because it also protects the client from a content intervention that might be very useful and which could save a lot of time. If the client has to come up with a new categorization of the problem in which they are stuck, they will often be unable to think of useful one that might be very obvious to the therapist or someone else. If the client has to come up with a new categorization of the problem in which they are stuck, they will often be unable to think of a useful one that might be very obvious to the therapist or someone else. When you are inside a box, it is hard to think outside the box. Input from outside the box can sometimes speed up the process of reaching resolution immensely. For instance, in dealing with objections to reach forgiveness, many people say angrily that the other person doesn't deserve to be forgiven. If this objection is not resolved, it will prevent the person from reaching forgiveness and resolution. I know from experience that this objection can be resolved very quickly and easily by a simple change of scope. You may be absolutely right that they don't deserve forgiveness. However, forgiveness isn't for them, it is for you, so that you can be free of resentment, obsessive thoughts about revenge, etc. As Nelson Mandela said after spending 27 years in prison, resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for your enemies to die. It could take most clients months or years to find this essential understanding on their own. While this is certainly an example of the therapist offering content to the client, it is one that can help the client become open to a very useful resolution. When someone is grieving over a loss, they often make the mistake of recalling the ending of the relationship rather than the treasured experiences that are no longer available to them. The first step is resolving grief, is to replace this image of the ending with an image of the relationship at its best. Without this change in content, it is impossible to resolve grief. Of course, introducing content in this way is also a double-edged sword. While an appropriate content intervention can speed up a process, an inappropriate content intervention can divert the client's attention from the problem to be solved and even make a problem worse. Clean language is an evaluative term that categorizes, not introducing content as clean, and by implication, any content intervention as dirty. One more time. Clean language is an evaluative term that categorizes not introducing content as clean, and implication, any content intervention as dirty. Okay, makes sense. Either can be useful depending on the goal and the result. So I think it is inappropriate to use an evaluative term for one of the other except as it is applied in particular context. Perhaps content-free response would be a more descriptive term than clean language. Despite the specificity of this approach and the emphasis on clean language, there are two elements that are uncontrolled and can still allow the bias of the therapist's beliefs and orientation to influence the client. The first is the choice of which words of the client to repeat back to them. A single word, a phrase, or everything the client has just said, depending on where you want to direct their attention, allows a lot of opportunity for bias. For instance, a therapist with traditional psychiatric or psychodynamic training would be likely to choose words or phrases hinting at disease, pathology, or problems. Their nonverbal responses will also have the same bias, leading the client to explore past events and causes. Someone with solution-focused training would likely choose words that indicate present competence, future possibility, and solutions with accompanying nonverbal signaling. This bias is much more likely to result in exploring future solutions. A second source of potential bias is in the choice of which questions to ask. Again, someone with psychodynamic training would be more likely to ask questions about the past, despite the fact that more of the questions are directed toward future possibility, could, would, while someone with solution-focused training would tend to ask even more questions about future possibility. Tracking scope and category. In previous chapters, I asked you to think of an unpleasant memory or problem and track scope alone, and then category alone, to begin to apply these ideas. However, every scope is immediately categorized, and every category is a collection of scopes. Scope and category are never found alone, but are continually interacting in the flow of experience. Doing something different with either or both allows someone to have different experience of a problem. That is why therapeutic approach like symbolic modeling with clean language can work, and this is also something that you can also do on your own when you find that your experience is limited or unpleasant. For example, recently I was seated on an airplane next to a couple who were interacting in a way that I found irritating. However, she would say something, he would interrupt loudly. Whenever she would say something, he would interrupt loudly, often say the opposite, telling her how to think and what she should do in a future situation that they were discussing. He was behaving in a way that most would say was controlling, arrogant, superior, and disrespectful of her. I noticed that I was thinking of him using a stereotype of redneck farmer who never listens to others. She was behaving in a complimentary ways, using a tone of voice that was soft, hesitant, a little whiny, and submissive, and I found myself thinking of her as if she were a typical whining dog being punished. When I examined my experience, I noticed that I categorized their exchange as one that was causing them both unhappiness, and that probably it was a theme that occurred through their relationship and expansion of scope. I imagined being each of them and how they were feeling, both of which were unpleasant, and then felt irritated myself. I imagined what I might say that could be useful to them in changing their interaction, but then I categorized that as not useful, since they had not invited any input from a stranger, and would probably think of it as an imposition. I imagined that especially the husband would not be open to what I might say. Having noticed all this, and having decided not to say anything, I turned my attention to how I could make my experience more pleasant, another scope change. I couldn't avoid listening to them, but I could choose how I listened. I first recategorized the whole situation as something I could be curious about and learn from, rather than one in which I should do something. That shift in categorization redirected my attention from what I might do in the future to what they were doing in the present, a two-fold shift in scope. I began paying more attention to the smaller details of their interaction, exactly what tone of voice and tempo that each of them used, and the different ways he interrupted her with his opinions, etc. As I did this, I withdrew my attention from their feelings, and my feelings of irritation. The more I attended to the fine details of their exchange, the more I felt interest and pleasure in my little discoveries. I was learning to hone my ability to notice subtle shifts of voice tone and tempo, etc., and how they reveal the experiences of these two people. The first step toward doing this in a directed way is to track what you are already doing in a problem state, noticing the scopes and categories in your thinking. The next is to experiment with changing some of those scopes and categories in order to improve your experience. The following exercise can be an introduction to doing this. Scope and category script exercise. First, problem. Think of an unpleasant memory or problem, event that still bothers you when you think of it. Second, review a movie of that event with sound and feeling from the very beginning to the end of it. 3. Write a script. Now, imagine that a friend is going to produce a movie of your experience of this event. You need to provide a script so that the movie your friend makes will be an accurate representation of your experience. Jot down a sentence or two for each scope and each category in your experience of this event. Review 4. Review script. Now go back over this script and further specify the scope of each part of it.